Namaskar and welcome viewers. You're with me Surbhi Unyal and I teach philosophy at Hansraj College, University of Delhi. Friends, we are doing a series on Introduction to Philosophy and in that we are doing Indian philosophy. In our today's lecture, we have been discussing, in our previous lecture we discussed Nyāya Philosophy and we will be continuing with the Nyāya Philosophy in this lecture as well. Within the Nyāya philosophy, we were doing the epistemology of Nyāyikas. We discussed that knowledge could be considered to be of two types. It could be valid knowledge, it could be invalid knowledge, prama or aprama. We also discussed that what are the various types which comes under prama and what comes under aprama. Continuing with that, we were discussing that how is knowledge actually possible or how does knowledge generates. We'll continue with that. So, knowledge according to the Nyāyikas, it depends on the conditions where there is an appropriate and conducive to producing an accurate knowledge, valid knowledge, where there is a proper connection between the soul and the not soul. So, when there is this connection or a contact of the soul with the object which are considered to be as not soul, that is when the knowledge is produced. So, knowledge we considered that it could be seen as a result of interaction of the soul and the object. Now, Nyāya philosophy they recognizes that the generation of knowledge, it depends on conditions under which it occurs. So, if the conditions are appropriate and they are conducive to producing accurate and valid knowledge, then the knowledge is considered valid. Fine, and we discussed this elaborately in the previous lecture that for prama to arise, that means for a valid knowledge to take place, we need to have valid sources of knowledge. So, we need to have valid prama on the basis of which we will get prama, that means knowledge. Now, these if they are conducive, if they are able to produce accurate knowledge, if these means are conducive, then we will get valid knowledge. However, if the generating conditions are defective or if they are flawed in some way, then the resulting knowledge may be invalid or erroneous. Fine. So, the knowledge actually depends on the conditions on which it is generating. So, if the conditions are favorable, if the conditions are valid, then the knowledge will be valid. If the conditions are defective, then definitely the knowledge would automatically turns out to be invalid or erroneous. So, the Nyāya school, they consider valid knowledge is obtained through the use of reliable means, which is I have been emphasizing again and again on the means which is the praman. And these four valid means on which the knowledge could arise, they are perception, inference, comparison and testimony. So, these pramans they serve as the basis for determining the truth or validity of the knowledge claims. Continuing with that, let us first talk about what is perception, which is considered to be the valid means of knowledge or one of the praman. Let us discuss what is perception, since perception is one of the most important means of valid knowledge. So, Gautama defines perception as non-erroneous cognition which is produced by the intercourse of sense organs with the objects, which is not associated with a name and which is well defined. This is the, you can say, a comprehensive understanding of what is meant by perception according to Gautama. So, it is non-erroneous cognition. It is produced by the intercourse of sense organs with the objects. It is not associated with name, yet it is well defined. Let us look at the Sanskrit definition which is given in Nyāya Sutra or perception. It is as stated, which is that Indriyarth sa nikarshottapam jnanam avyapyadeshvam avyabhichari vyavasatmakam pratyaksham. This is a very important definition to describe perception, which has been stated in the Nyāya Sutra given by the Gautama. Let us look at, or let us break down this definition, and let us try to understand what these terms in this whole definition really signifies. So, Indriyarth sa nikarshottapam jnanam, let us understand this term first. It means, or it refers to the knowledge that arises from the contact between the sense organs or the indriyas and their respective objects. So, in Nyāya philosophy, perception is considered as direct and immediate source of knowledge, where the senses or the sense organs, indriyas, they come into the contact with the external world. So, Indriyarth sa nikarshottapam jnanam. Okay, so indriyas are coming into the contact with the external world or with the objects, and that is where the knowledge is arising. Avyapyadeshyam, it signifies that which cannot be expressed through words. So, according to Nyāya, certain aspects of perceptual knowledge cannot be fully conveyed through language or description alone. There are aspects of perception that are infable or beyond the reach of the linguistic expressions, and therefore there is no word to describe them. Then comes avyabhichari. This term, it denotes the certainty or non-contradictory nature of perception. Fine, so it implies that perception provides knowledge that is free from doubt or ambiguity. So, if you have ambiguity, if you are doubtful about something, that itself means that you are not certain. Fine, so doubt is opposite to certainty. So, if you have doubt, you cannot be certain, and that cannot be considered to be knowledge. And we discussed in a previous lecture that invalid knowledge, within the invalid knowledge, doubt is considered to be an invalid knowledge. Why? Because we cannot be certain about it. So, this avyabhichari nature in perception, they are trying to emphasize upon certainty and upon non-contradictory nature of the perception. Only then it could be considered as knowledge. So, when perception occurs, there is no wavering or variability in the knowledge that is produced. Then comes vyavasatmakam. This word describes perception as determinate or definite. It suggests that perception provides knowledge that is specific and that is definite, and it allows for clear understanding of the object perceived, because it is giving us the direct or the definite knowledge. Now, having talked about this, having talked about the definition of perception, now let us understand what are the various types of perception. So, perception, we discussed that it arises from the sense object contacts. Now, how this contact could be understood? It is of two ways that it can be understood. So, perception could be an ordinary perception which is known as logic, and it could also be extraordinary perception which is allokic. So, ordinary perception, it presupposes the sense organs, it presupposes the objects, it presupposes manas and the self, and along with these things there has to be a mutual contact between the sense organs, the objects, the manas and the self. Only when there is a mutual contact between them, the ordinary perception takes place. So, what happens is that the self, it comes into the contact with the manas. The manas with the sense organs and the sense organs with the object. So, that is how the flow is going, or the contact, mutual contact is taking place. So, self is getting contact or is having a contact with the manas. Manas has the contact with the sense organs, and these sense organs have contact with the object. Now, the contact of the sense organs with the object is not possible unless the manas first comes into the contact with the sense organs, and the contact of the manas with the sense organ is not possible unless the self comes into the contact with the manas. Hence, you can say the sense object contact, it necessarily presupposes manas sense contact and self manas contact. Fine. So, it is let me just repeat it again very precisely, that if you are talking about the sense organs and the sense object contact, it is not just there has to be a self, there has to be manas, there has to be sense organs and the object, and there has to be mutual cooperation or mutual contact of all these together. That is when the ordinary perception can take place. And in this, the self will come into the contact with the manas, manas will come into the contact with sense organs will come into the contact with the objects. So, unless this process takes place, we cannot have ordinary perception. Fine. So, sense object contact, it necessarily presupposes that there has to be a contact between manas and the sense objects, sense organs, and the self must have a contact with the manas. Only then this process takes place. So, sense organs are derived from elements whose specific qualities are that of smell, taste, color, touch and sound are manifested by them. So, the manas is the mediator between the self and the sense organs. So, the external objects through the senses and the manas makes an impression on the self. Fine. So, the external objects through the senses and the manas, it will make an impression on the self, and this theory is therefore referred to as realistic, or therefore they are considered to be realists. Now, again, ordinary perception is also of two types. It could be internal and it could be external. Internal perception, which is here the mind or the manas, which is the internal organ, it comes into the contact with the psychical states and processes. Fine, those psychical states and processes that are happening within us, like that of cognition, desire, aversion, pain, pleasure, affection. All these are psychical states, and the mind or the manas, it comes into the contact with these psychical states, which are the things happening within us. So therefore it is known as internal perception, because you are trying to perceive what's going on within you, what you are feeling, what you are thinking. Suppose you have a desire or pain or pleasure, all that are cognized by the mind or the manas. Okay, and manas or the mind have a contact with these psychical states, and that's how we know them, or we can perceive them through internally. So that is known as internal perception. External perception, on the other hand, it takes place when 5 external organs of senses, they come into the contact with external objects. Fine, and it is of 5 kinds. It could be visual, auditory, tactual, gustatory or olfactory, brought about by the sense organs of sight, sound, touch, taste, smell respectively, when they come into the contact with the external objects. So there are external objects, and our senses come into the contact with those external objects. That's how we perceive them. We either see them, we hear them, we taste them, or we feel them, and that's how we are having external perception. Fine. So these are the types of ordinary perception, and in those ordinary perception we talked about internal and the external perception. Now let us talk about what is extraordinary perception. Extraordinary perception is of 3 kinds. Those are Samanya Lakshana, Jnana Lakshana and Yogaj. Samanya Lakshana perception, you can say it is a perception of universals. Okay, here what happens, or you can say that in other words, it is a perception of classes. So according to Nyāya, the universals are distinct classes. Okay, they are separate or a distinct class. They inhere in all the particular belonging to the same class. Since these are distinct classes of reals, they inhere in particulars which belong to different classes on account of different universals inhering in them, and that's how we can differentiate between different classes. So an individual, it belongs to a particular class because the universal of that class which inheres in it. Fine. So we can say that a cow, which is an individual cow, but falling under a particular class of cows. Why? Because it has the universal cowness which inheres in it. Fine. So an individual, it is falling, or it belongs to a particular class. Why? Because that class inheres a universal in it, and that's how we are able to differentiate between different particular classes. So a cow becomes a cow because it has a universal cowness which inheres in it. Okay. Ordinarily what happens is, ordinarily we perceive only particulars and not the universals. Okay, through the ordinary perception we are talking about. So through the ordinary perception we perceive only the particulars, not the universal. We perceive particular cow. Okay, when you look at a cow, what happens is you are perceiving a particular cow, but we do not perceive universal cowness. Therefore, the Nyayikas, they maintain that universals are perceived extraordinarily. Fine. So that extraordinary perception is known as Samanya Lakshana perception. So wherever or whenever we perceive a particular cow, we first perceive the universal cowness which is inhering in it, and this universal cowness means the characteristics which which makes cow cow. So why do we say that this is a cow? Because there are qualities that are inhering in that particular object or thing, due to which we say that it is a cow and not something else, not a tiger or not the other animal, because it is inhering those universal cowness in it. And this universal cowness, we do not gain it through ordinary perception. It is gained through extraordinary perception, which is known as Samanya Lakshana. Now comes Jnana Lakshana perception. Jnana Lakshana perception is the perception through complex association. What happens that in this case, an object is not directly presented in front of your senses, but it is retrieved from the memory through the past cognitions of it and how we had perceived them in the past. So, they are known through representation. It is complicated perception through association. Here what happens is, here an object is not directly presented to the sense organs, but it is revived in the memory through the past cognition that we might have had of it or related object, and is perceived through representation. For example, let us say if I am looking at a blooming rose and I am at a quite distance, I am not near to that rose. So, what happens is that I am looking at this rose, beautiful red rose I am looking at, and I utter that I see a fragrant rose. Look at this sentence very carefully. I am saying I see a fragrant rose. But how can fragrance be seen? Fine, we cannot see fragrance, we can only smell it. So, it can only be smelt, we cannot see it. So, if we are uttering a statement like I see a fragrant rose, how are we making this sentence, or how are we uttering this sentence? Fragrance can be perceived by sense organ of smell and not by the sense organ of vision, which can perceive only the colors. So, here the visual perception of the rose, it revives in the memory the idea of fragrance by association, which was perceived in the past through the nose. So, the perception of fragrant rose through the eyes therefore is called Jnana Lakshana perception, or perception revived in memory through the cognition or Jnana of the past, of the object in the past. Fine. So, here the purpose of nose is done through the eyes. Why? Because we are not actually smelling the flower at the moment, but we have smelled it earlier. So, when now I am looking at a similar kind of a flower or the same flower from a distance, I am able to utter a statement like I see a fragrant rose, because I know that the roses of this kind are fragrant or they have good smell. From my past memory I know that. So, here they are saying that this is Jnana Lakshana perception, because the fragrance of the rose is known through eyes, which is not really its purpose. Eyes can only see, but here the eyes are, through the association you can say, is doing the purpose of the nose. So, through memory we are reviving and we are uttering such a kind of statement, and hence it is extraordinary perception. The third kind of extraordinary perception is known as Yogaj perception. This is the intuitive and immediate perception of all objects in the past, present and the future. So, at once you can know all the objects in the past, present and the future. This kind of knowledge is only possessed by the yogins through the power of meditation. So, such a kind of knowledge again is extraordinary, because you are able to know objects from the past, the present and the future, and not everybody can know that. Only yogins, because they have attained that level in meditation that they are able to see the past, present and the future, and therefore only yogins can have this kind of perception, which is known as Yogaj perception. The last thing that we are going to discuss today is the stages in perception. So, Nyayikas, they maintain that there are two stages in perception. The first is called indeterminate or nirvikalpaka perception, and the second is called determinate or savikalpaka perception. These two stages are recognized by Gautama in his definition of perception, which we have already done, that perception is unassociated with name, avyapadeshvam, which means that it is indeterminate, and it is well defined, which is vyavasatmaka, which means that it is determinate. So, all perception is determinate, but it is necessarily preceded by an earlier stage which is indeterminate. So, nirvikalpaka perception is the first stage of perception, it is indeterminate perception. It refers to the initial stage of sensory experiences, where the sensory information is received by the sense organ, but it is not yet been fully processed. So, you are just, it is a mere perception where you have not yet conceptualized, or you can say you have not been able to categorize in the mind. So, in this stage the perceiver is aware of the general sense of sensory input, but does not have a clear and distinct understanding or identification of the perceived object. So, it is more immediate and undifferentiated experience. Now, it is, as I mentioned, it is just bare awareness or bare perception, it is direct sense experience which is undifferentiated and non-relational, and is free from, it is free from analysis, it is free from discrimination or synthesis, because you have not yet conceptualized it, it is mere perception. The second is the savikalpaka perception or the determinate perception. Here it occurs when the mind actively engages in processing and categorizing the sensory information received from the sense organs. In this stage, the perceiver, it recognizes and identifies the specific qualities, attributes and characteristics of the perceived objects. The sensory data here is organized, it is classified and given meaning by the mind. So, therefore, it is known as savikalpaka perception. I am going to quickly take up one example here, and with that we will finish. That imagine, let us say you are walking in the forest and suddenly you catch a glimpse of a tall object with a greenish color. So, in this initial stage of perception, you have indeterminate or nirvikalpaka perception. You are aware of general sensory inputs, recognizing the presence of an object with certain qualities like height and color. However, you may not have fully identified or characterized it as a tree yet, or which tree it is. So, it is a more immediate, undifferentiated and less specific experience. Then as you continue to observe it and you focus it more on that object, your mind, it actively engages in processing the sensory information. You recognize the specific features of the object, such as the trunk, branches, leaves and the overall structure, and you categorize it as a tree and form a clear and distinct perception. So, this stage of perception is called savikalpaka. So, when you have a determinate perception, you have actively identified and differentiated the object as a specific kind of a tree based on its qualities and attributes. For example, it was a mango tree that you came to realize that it is through its qualities and various attributes by looking at its leaves or the fruits that are hanging on the trees. So, that is the savikalpaka perception. So, thank you friends. With this we come to an end of our discussion on perception. We will be taking the rest of the Praman in our next lecture. So, do follow up the lectures and have a clear understanding of what are the various types of Praman. Thank you.